It was one of those evenings when the rain seemed to wash away the noise of the city, leaving behind a gentle patter against windows and the soft hum of distant traffic. I found myself seeking shelter in a small diner on the corner of Maple and Fifth, a place I'd passed countless times but never entered. The neon sign flickered, open 24 hours, casting a warm red glow onto the wet pavement outside. There's something about diners that has always drawn me in. Perhaps it's the promise of comfort food or the nostalgic atmosphere that seems frozen in time, a place where strangers become temporary companions over coffee and pie. I've always been something of an observer in life. My friends often joke that I'm the one taking mental notes at parties instead of fully participating. It's not that I'm antisocial, quite the opposite. I find people fascinating, their stories, their mannerisms, the way their eyes light up when talking about something they love. But I've always maintained a certain distance, especially when it comes to romantic connections. Past relationships had left me cautious, perhaps overly so. I'd built walls so gradually I hardly noticed how high they'd become until I realized how few people I'd allowed to climb them. As I shook the raindrops from my umbrella and stepped into the warmth of the diner, I noticed it was surprisingly busy for a Tuesday evening. The scent of coffee and grilled onions filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of something baking in the kitchen. The waitress, a woman with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes, nodded toward the back when I asked about seating. "Only one booth left, honey. Might have to share if someone else comes in." I made my way to the corner booth, sliding into the worn red vinyl seat that had clearly hosted thousands of conversations before mine. I ordered a coffee and opened the dog-eared menu, though I already knew I wanted something warm and comforting. Perhaps the meatloaf special advertised on the chalkboard near the entrance. That's when the bell above the door chimed, and he walked in. He wasn't the type to command attention when entering a room. Not tall enough, not loud enough. But there was something about him that drew my gaze immediately. Perhaps it was the way he moved with a quiet confidence, or how his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled at the waitress. His dark hair was damp from the rain, curling slightly at his temples, and he wore a faded blue jacket that looked well-loved rather than worn out. When the waitress pointed toward my booth, our eyes met briefly across the room, and I felt an unexpected flutter in my chest. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. "Seems like we're the last two souls braving the storm tonight." There was a warmth in his tone that matched the diner's atmosphere, inviting and unpretentious. I gestured to the seat across from me. "Please, I'd appreciate the company." The words surprised me as they left my mouth. I typically valued my solitude, especially after long days. But something about this stranger made me curious rather than cautious. He slid into the booth, introduced himself as Ethan, and ordered coffee before asking what had brought me to the diner on such a rainy night. There was something refreshingly direct about him, interested without being intrusive. Our conversation flowed easily, jumping from the weather to books we'd recently read, discovering a shared love for mystery novels and documentaries about obscure historical events. "Have you read that new one about the lighthouse keepers who disappeared in 1900? He asked, leaning forward slightly, his eyes brightening with enthusiasm. I couldn't put it down. "The Vanishing at Eilean Moor?" I replied, surprised. "I just finished it last week. I've been trying to convince my friends to read it, but they're not into historical mysteries. They're lost," he said with a grin that made something warm bloom in my chest. I love how the author balanced the historical facts with the human stories. Made those men feel real, you know? The waitress brought our food, meatloaf for me, a Reuben sandwich for him, and our conversation continued uninterrupted. We discovered other shared interests, hiking trails in the nearby mountains, a preference for small independent theaters over multiplexes, and a mutual addiction to a podcast about unsolved scientific mysteries. Each revelation felt like uncovering a piece of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving. Then something unexpected happened. As the waitress cleared our plates and brought dessert menus, Ethan slid from his side of the booth to mine. It wasn't an aggressive move. He did it casually, as if to better see the dessert menu I was holding, but the sudden proximity sent a jolt through me. I could smell his cologne now, something subtle with notes of cedar and bergamot. Our shoulders touched lightly as he pointed to the apple pie a la mode. "The classic choice," he said, his voice softer now that we were closer. "Hard to beat warm apple pie on a rainy night." I was acutely aware of how our knees almost touched under the table, how his presence beside me rather than across created an entirely different dynamic. The booth suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Most surprising was that I didn't mind. In fact, I found myself shifting slightly closer rather than away. I'm more of a chocolate person myself, I replied, pointing to the double chocolate cake. Though I'm tempted by the key lime pie. Let's get both and share, he suggested, and the simple proposal felt strangely significant. A tiny commitment to extend our time together, to share something. When the desserts arrived, we traded forks halfway through, commenting on the perfect tartness of the lime and the richness of the chocolate. Our conversation deepened as the diner gradually emptied around us. He told me about growing up in a small coastal town, how he'd moved to the city for work but still missed the sound of waves at night. I shared stories about my eccentric family, my struggles finding my footing in a career I loved, and my recent decision to pursue a long-abandoned passion for photography. What stopped you before? He asked, genuinely curious. From pursuing photography, I mean. I hesitated, unaccustomed to being so transparent with someone I'd just met. Fear, I suppose. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of trying something I love and discovering I have no talent for it. That's the most human fear there is, he said, nodding. We're all afraid of loving something that doesn't love us back. The simple truth of his statement resonated deeply. I realized he hadn't moved back to his side of the booth, and more surprisingly, I didn't want him to. There was something comforting about his presence beside me, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature in the diner. As we talked, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of the small details about him. The tiny scar near his right eyebrow, the way he gestured with his hands when explaining something he was passionate about, how he really listened when I spoke instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. These observations weren't just passive, they stirred something in me, a curiosity that felt dangerously close to attraction. But with that realization came the familiar guard, rising up like an old friend. What was I doing? Opening up to a stranger in a diner, feeling flutters of attraction, imagining possibilities beyond this rainy evening? This wasn't like me. I was the cautious one, the one who kept people at a comfortable distance, the one who had been hurt enough to know better. My sudden withdrawal must have been visible because he paused mid-sentence. Did I say something wrong? He asked, concern evident in his expression. No, not at all, I assured him quickly. I just realized how late it's getting. It wasn't entirely a lie. The clock above the counter showed it was approaching midnight, but it wasn't the complete truth either. We have been here a while, he acknowledged with a smile. Time flies in good company. There was an opening in his words, an invitation to acknowledge what was happening between us. But I hesitated, caught between the comfortable patterns of my past and the uncertain promise of something new. He sensed my reluctance and gave me space, shifting slightly to create a breath of distance between us. I should probably get going, I said finally, reaching for my wallet. Early morning tomorrow. He nodded, but as I began to gather my things, he gently touched my wrist. Before you go, he said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that matched my own unspoken feelings. I'd like to ask you something. I paused, my heart suddenly racing for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. What is it? I've enjoyed talking with you more than any conversation I've had in months, he said simply. Would it be all right if I asked for your number? Maybe we could continue this over coffee sometime, when you're not rushing to an early morning commitment. There was a teasing warmth in his last words that made me smile despite my reservations. I found myself at a crossroads. Retreat to the safety of my carefully constructed walls, or take a step towards something unknown but potentially wonderful. In that moment of hesitation, a memory surfaced, something my grandmother had told me years ago when I'd been nursing a particularly painful heartbreak. The heart is resilient, she'd said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. It's designed to heal and grow stronger. But it can't do either if you keep it locked away. As I looked at Ethan, with his kind eyes and the way he'd respected my sudden withdrawal without pressing or dismissing it, I felt something shift within me. Perhaps the walls I'd built weren't protecting me, but imprisoning me instead. I'd like that, I said finally, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I took out my phone and we exchanged numbers, our fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. As we prepared to leave, the waitress brought our check with a knowing smile. You two remind me of my husband and me, she said, nodding toward a photograph behind the counter of a younger version of herself with a man whose smile reached all the way to his eyes. We met right here in this diner 43 years ago. Sometimes you just know when it's right. Her words hung in the air between us as we paid our bills. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the clean scent that only comes after rain. "Which way are you headed?" Ethan asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside the diner. "Downtown," I replied, pointing east. "About 15 minutes walk." "I'm heading that way too," he said. "Mind if I walk with you?" Again, that choice, retreat or advance. This time, the decision came more easily. I'd like the company. We walked side by side through the quiet streets, our conversation continuing as if we'd never left the booth. He told me about his favorite spot in the city, a hidden garden behind the old library that few people knew about. I shared my secret viewpoint on the west side of the park that had the best sunset views. Each exchange felt like trading small treasures, building a collection of shared knowledge. As we approached my apartment building, a tension grew between us, not uncomfortable, but charged with possibility. We slowed our pace, both seemingly reluctant for the evening to end. "This is me," I said, stopping before the steps leading to my building's entrance. He nodded, looking up at the old brownstone with appreciation. "Nice place. Probably has character. Creaky floors and temperamental plumbing." I laughed. "But yes, character in abundance." We stood facing each other, the moment suspended between us. In movies, this would be where the kiss happens, the perfect conclusion to an unexpected evening. But real life is messier, more uncertain. Instead, he took my hand briefly, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a gesture that felt both respectful and intimate. "Thank you for sharing your booth," he said softly. "And your evening. And your thoughts about lighthouse keepers and chocolate cake. Thank you for sliding to my side and staying there." I replied, the words carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested. He smiled, understanding the weight behind my response. "I'll call you tomorrow. Maybe we can check out that independent bookstore you mentioned." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it more than I'd expected to. As I watched him walk away, turning once to wave before rounding the corner, I realized something had changed within me. The walls I'd built so carefully hadn't come crashing down. That would have been too dramatic, too simplistic. Instead, it felt as though a door had appeared in those walls, one I had chosen to unlock and open, just enough to let possibility enter. Inside my apartment, I found myself smiling at nothing in particular as I went through my nighttime routine. The evening replayed in my mind. The initial awkwardness of sharing a booth with a stranger, the surprising ease of our conversation, the moment he moved to my side, and how natural it had felt to have him there. I thought about what might come next, a phone call tomorrow, perhaps that trip to the bookstore, maybe more dinners and conversations. There were no guarantees, of course. This connection might fade with daylight, becoming nothing more than a pleasant memory of a rainy evening. Or it might grow into something significant, something that would make tonight seem like the first chapter of a longer story. What mattered most wasn't the outcome but the choice I'd made, to open that door in my walls, to allow myself to feel the flutter of possibility again. For someone who had spent years observing life rather than fully participating in it, this small step felt monumental. As I drifted toward sleep, I remembered the waitress's words about knowing when something was right. I wasn't sure if this was right. It was too soon, too new to know that with any certainty. But it felt like it could be, and for now, that possibility was enough. 6 months later, Ethan and I returned to that same diner, sliding into the same booth where we'd first met. The same waitress recognized us immediately, bringing coffee without being asked and winking as she set down the mugs. "Knew at the moment I saw you too," she said with satisfaction. This time, we didn't sit across from each other at all. He slid in beside me from the start, our shoulders touching comfortably, our hands finding each other under the table as naturally as breathing. The booth felt different now, not a chance meeting place, but a landmark in our shared geography, a point on the map of our evolving story. "Remember when I first moved to your side of the booth?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of shared history. "I remember thinking you were very bold," I replied, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "I remember being terrified you'd ask me to move back," he admitted with a laugh. "But something told me to take that risk." As we ordered, Meatloaf for me, Reuben for him. Just like the first night, I realized how that simple act of sliding across a booth had become symbolic of everything that followed. The gradual closing of distance, the choice to be closer rather than farther apart, the courage to share space, and eventually, to share our lives. The rain began to fall outside, pattering against the windows just as it had on that first night. We stayed in our booth long after our plates were cleared, talking about everything and nothing, making plans and sharing dreams. And when we finally left, walking together through the rain-washed streets, I thought about how sometimes the most significant journeys begin with the smallest movements, like sliding across a booth towards someone who feels like home. Total _char_count, 17,814.